place you are in. So I have done my best to do that. I haven't been here very long, but I've already had fried clams and lobster and ice cream, and waffle. I'm really trying to do that as much as I can while I'm here. It is always so much fun to be able to talk with Greg and now John about their art. I have to do I've known John since he was like this, and my children are like that too, so it is really so cool to be able to do this with them. Nadine had mentioned that actually by training I'm an art historian, so I just have this annoying art historian reflex, which is if you see something you say, oh yeah, that reminds me of a it's just what art historians do. And so that's what I'm going to share with you today, and then have a conversation with each of them. First with Greg down here, and we'll just look at a couple of works with each of them, and then obviously you stay longer and talk with each of them one-on-one, but just so it doesn't get too long for everybody. So with Greg, as I was looking at this show with him last night, and of course as I think about him as a person, as the incredible scientist that he is, as well as an artist, I of course thought of Leonardo da Vinci, who is really the only artist ever, possibly until Greg Mort, and I'm really serious about this, who completely integrated science and art. We think of Leonardo da Vinci and we think of the Mona Lisa, but that's not the way he thought of himself. Leonardo da Vinci, who was active as an artist from about 1485, 88 to about 1516 or so that's the time frame we're talking about. He wrote at one point in the 1490s or so, he wrote a letter to the Duke of Milan, because the way artists worked then is they would put themselves in service of Duke or Duchess or somebody running a city-state. And he offered his services to the Duke of Milan, which is already really interesting because he was living in Florence, which was the coolest place artistically to be, but he didn't really like Michelangelo. He couldn't stand Michelangelo and he's such a namby-pamby. He wanted to go instead to Milan, which was really the most antagonistic. That was the place that made war. That was the identity of Milan, making war, and that's where he wanted to go. And he recommended himself to the Duke of Milan by saying, I can build a statue of your father, I can redirect the direction of the river, I can build water hydraulic things, I can build the most terrifying weapons you've ever seen that will decimate people, I can build battlements, I can build flying machines, I recite poetry, I play music, and I also can paint. And that was where it was for him. It was, I can also do that. I wouldn't say it's quite that for Greg Mort, but anyone who knows him well knows that you can find him awake in any given night at 3 o'clock in the morning looking at his telescope, examining the sky. You know that he's been honored by various astronomical institutions around the country, and that he is equally respected as a scientist as an artist. And I was struck with this show more almost than any I've seen recently by him, of the real integration of scientific knowledge with his art. And I'm going to just lead into my conversation with Greg by reading something from Leonardo that I think is so amazing. First of all, to think of someone writing this in around 1500, but then I also want you to think about Greg's perspective. Leonardo wrote, "The Earth is not in the center of the sun's orbit, nor at the center of the universe, but in the center of its companion elements and united with them. And anyone standing on the moon," now, who thought of standing on the moon in 1500? "When it and the sun are both beneath us, would see this our earth and the element of water upon it just as we see the moon, and the earth would light it as it lights us." Just an amazing thing to think of. But then, I of course, you read that, and then you look at a painting like this one, which has this amazing image of the moon being lit from below, and just that little kind of humanizing element of the tree that gives you some sense of scale. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with that painting?
Well, it's the title of the painting is Galileo's Wisdom, and it's a tip of the hat and a little salute to Galileo, another famous preeminent early scientist. But first of all, I have to thank Professor Schneider for coming here and doing this with us. And I'm very humbled that she would have the audacity to compare me with someone like Leonardo da Vinci. And I have the advantage of having a number of centuries pass.
I want to get out of the way of the painting so people can see it.
A number of centuries pass to which I have a lot more information to build on. But knowing all that, I mean, I think part of what my art is, part of why it is what it is because of the time I live in, and because I've sort of bore witness to something like the space program. So certainly my perspective that I have now is unique because of those historical elements. So I can't help seeing things perhaps differently, but amazingly, like you pointed out about Leonardo's observation, that I had not heard that quote before. It's just amazing to think that someone from that much time ago could have such a perspective. I think that shows an incredible leap of faith. So what I like to do, perhaps Leonardo would agree with it, is to challenge the viewer to show a perspective, to show a counterpoint of images that somehow surprise the viewer, maybe to drive the viewer to a further realization. In this case, it's an element of scale, and often when people see a picture that has these sort of juxtaposition of scales, they'll say, well, why did you make the moon so big, you know? And really it's because the tree is actually quite far away from the viewer, so therefore smaller than the angular size of the moon. So it's not an unrealistic picture, although at first glance one might assume that. And you know, talking about the art about observing, it's something, the moon, of course, we've all looked at our whole lives, and it's something that I'm always aware of. And this property that we call the earth shine, which is, as Cynthia said, the light of the earth actually reflecting back and illuminating the non-solar illuminated side of the moon. It's something that's quite beautiful. You see it near the early stages of the moon's progression. You see it later in the morning. So this would be in the evening, just before the crescent moon is setting. You'll see this dramatic earth shine. So it's a celebration of science and art, I think. That's one of the things that I have tried to bring together, because as I was talking earlier with Cynthia, one of Leonardo's quotes was that art really is the true daughter of science. So he, perhaps one of the earlier, perhaps the first to weave these things together. I more or less walk in his shadow and his footsteps in that regard.
So now talking about shadow, I'm going to look at this painting. I'm going to reference some of the other paintings here, but not, there are too many of you to move around. You won't be able to see things. But another one of the things that Leonardo wrote about was the effect of light in the distance. And you know, artists long before him understood this concept that our objects in the distance are paler and fainter, but they didn't understand how to translate that into something that was optically convincing. So you would have paintings that were brown in the foreground, green in the middle, and blue in the distance, but quite sharp divisions. So you kind of understood what each one was, but it wasn't optically correct. That's not the way we actually see the world. And Leonardo was really the first artist to use oil paint to demonstrate optically what we actually see, which are faint, hazy forms, but they dissolve gradually and become fainter gradually. And he very specifically described this effect and said, I'm trying to recreate in paint what we optically experience when we look at something in the distance. And Greg, I think in this show, which for those of you who are longtime Greg Mort fans, note that it's all oil. And you know, a few years ago, Greg would be doing all watercolor. It's very unusual for an artist to, I mean, artists do different media, yeah, but to completely shift and completely master a new medium, although I'm personally in favor of a little, come back a little bit of the watercolor, because I love the watercolors, but to shift over to a completely new medium is really an incredible thing to do. And I could see right from the first oils that Greg did, he understood this incredible capacity in oil, which you really can't do in watercolor, to create these hazy forms in the distance and to give a sense through light and shadow of distance and perspective. And you really see that in this painting, and also in the grayish painting sort of around in that corner there, and the one adjacent to it, which has those incredible little trails of fog that you have in Maine, you know, like floating ribbons of fog in the land. So maybe you can talk a little about all those, even if you can't see them all.
Well, it's an interesting thing that you pointed out about this, and you and I were talking about the word, it's an Italian word, sfumato, which is hard to say because it's an S and an F. Sfumato, and it means, you correct me, is it from smoke? Is that right? And this is just speaking about the mechanics of the difference between watercolor. I know there are other artists here, and you've experienced it, but the whole notion of watercolor, which you go from light, which is the paper, and then you go towards darkness. And normally speaking, you don't go back. It's kind of a one-way street. One of the things that Leonardo da Vinci mastered and discovered was this whole thing of sort of creating a darker background and then moving towards the light. So if you can imagine someone like myself who had been exclusively focusing on watercolor for many years. So, okay, we have this one-way street of light to dark. Now to start experimenting with this whole thing of, well, I can actually go backwards. I can actually create something that's darker and then move forward from it. So that whole experience was just sort of a revelation in one regard, but also so refreshing from working this other way. So I think that's part of the reason that I focus more on oil paintings, is this whole different way of working, which was sort of new and exciting. It doesn't diminish my passion or what I achieve with watercolor, but again, you have to understand this whole thing of sort of going back to zero and then saying, well, what could I do with this material?
And so I encourage everybody, when we're done, we're going to go upstairs in a moment to look at Jonathan's things too, but then when we're done, notice those little ribbons of fog and the hazy grays, incredible gradations of grays. Now the other thing that Leonardo really emphasized was perspective. And he said the most important thing, if you want to understand how to create space in art, is perspective. That's where everything begins and ends. And I don't think, I mean, perspective is integral to everything you do. It's critical in a landscape, of course, which always another thing to think about when you're looking at Greg's or anyone's paintings is, how did he decide to start it there? You know, where the closest point of the land is a critical element in any composition. And that really determines everything else. So I always wonder about that, looking at ours. How do you decide to do it there? And this painting here has a somewhat different perspective than we see, and it's a very dramatic and I think very effective perspective. I would say their perspective is sort of what the painting is about, in a way.
Yes, and this, for you, those of you who have been to shows before, you remember 3 years ago there was a painting that was actually done from the same model, and I incorporated a little photo of the model, which is about so big. And again, this is one of the tools that artists have often used, is because it allows you without offense, it allows you a godlike ability to choose your own angle, choose your own lighting. So even though it's quite a primitive little model, it enables me to get a seagull eye view of these would-be islands, but also, even more importantly, is to control and light, and also, you know, stop the sun from rotating. Any of you that have ever painted outside, one of the things you notice is how fast things change, is how the shadows are moving and the light is changing. So this is a really interesting painting because I've used a model and I could create a stationary artificial light that doesn't move. So you can see it's just a wonderful tool. But in doing that, you do create this sort of surreal, dreamlike quality. Number one, because most of us don't see the landscape from 500 feet up. So right away we're kind of like, ooh, this is weird. But anyway, this is, it's not a real place, but it's this model, but it's something that I've used before and will probably use again. It's it's kind of a wonderful thing to play with, you know, it's a power trip, let's face it.
But I want to make sure everyone understands what you're saying when you're saying model, because the painting is so convincing it'll be hard to believe. He's talking about he's setting up a little thing on a table with rocks and little weedy trees and creating this from that, which is, by the way, what the early Italian Renaissance artists did, was look at a single little rock and expand it, but I can tell you it didn't look like that. It looked really weird and totally unconvincing, but it didn't look as realistic as that, which is, I think, a great demonstration of how your painting is what another one of the artists I've studied, Samuel van Hoogstraten, a 17th century Dutch artist, he was the one who said that a painting is like a mirror of nature. But he went on to say that it's actually even almost better than nature, because in a painting you can leave things out that are there, you can add things that are not there, and you can basically enhance nature to make something that is even more beautiful and perfect. And I think you are able to do that in an extraordinary way. Now I want to shift to Jonathan and just say, before we go upstairs and look at a couple of his works, I want you all to just understand what actually goes on in here and in their house in Maryland, which I think is somewhat of a miracle. I don't know if any of you have children. I have two wonderful children who I adore, but I can no more imagine working every day in the same space with one of them in the same field than I could imagine flying to the moon. And, you know, the only person who might find that more difficult to imagine would be either one of my children. So here you have the two of them working together. Actually, I guess not really together. You've been kicked out of your studio, right?
Well, Jonathan needed a place to work, and, I'm happy to move into a larger space. So.
So you've been kicked out of your studio into another room, but they're nonetheless working under the same roof every day, both of them artists, and I think it says so much about each of them that Jonathan has developed in such an extraordinary way and in a completely different path. So that suggests, you know, you inspired him to be an artist, but also gave him the courage to go his own way.
Absolutely. Well, before we move upstairs, which I'm really excited to have you all see Jonathan's work and hear him speak about it, I really want to thank our good friend Aura, who has helped us out. Many of you have met her over the years, and she has faithfully returned. How many years have we done this? 12 years, okay. And I would also like to thank my daughter, Camissa, who's actually filming this right now, who's an art historian in her own right, and our good friend Jen Walker, who is helping us today, and Jen's around here someplace.
Well, and maybe we might mention Nadine.
And there's Jen Walker back there, and also Nadine, who is a constant support. She's way in the back, supporting nonetheless. But
critical element.
Thank you to each of those people for all your support to make this day and other days like this possible. Thank you all.
We can go upstairs. Let's go upstairs and you'll see something